It's the early hours of a morning in December 2012, inside a windowless interview room at the Federal Building in Anchorage, Alaska. Israel Keyes sits across a metal table from two federal agents, hands loosely folded, a legal pad in front of him that nobody but him has touched all night. He's somewhere past the 40th hour of what will eventually total dozens of hours of recorded interviews, spread across months, and right now he's drawing a map. Not a real one, no roads, no cities, no scale. Just a rough outline of the continental United States, sketched from memory, the kind of shape a person only gets right after years of thinking about geography the way most people think about grocery lists. He taps the pen somewhere in the upper Midwest and tells the agents, almost conversationally, that there's something buried there. Cash, probably. Tools. Maybe a weapon. He calls it a kill kit, and he tells them this particular one, they're never going to find, because he's the only living person who knows exactly where it is, and he has no plans to change that. The agents in that room already know Israel Keyes killed at least one teenage girl in Anchorage 9 months earlier. They know he abducted a married couple from their own bed in Vermont the year before that, 3,000 miles from home, in a state he had no ties to whatsoever. What they don't fully understand yet, what almost nobody in American law enforcement has had to reckon with at this scale before, is how many more of these buried spots exist across the country, planted years in advance by a man who planned murder with the same patience he brought to a kitchen remodel. Keyes has agreed to talk. But only on his own terms, in fragments, a name here, a season there, holding back just enough to keep himself useful, and keep the conversation, for now, alive. So how many people did Israel Keyes actually kill? And how much of it is he planning to take into the ground with him? One he says you'll never find. Rewind 3 decades, and there's almost nothing in Israel Keyes' early life that points toward any of this. He's born in January 1978, and spends most of his childhood moving between rural pockets of the Pacific Northwest and the Rockies, as his large family drifts through a series of small, isolated, self-sufficient religious communities before eventually settling for years near Colville, in the far northeastern corner of Washington state. He grows up mostly off the grid, homeschooled, minimal contact with any school system outside the family, a household built around self-reliance and doing things yourself rather than depending on anyone outside the family unit. People who crossed paths with him as a teenager would later describe someone quiet, physically capable, entirely comfortable spending days alone in the woods with nothing but a knife and a pack. None of that, taken alone, means anything. Plenty of homeschooled kids raised off the grid grow into perfectly unremarkable adults. Keyes doesn't. In his late teens he enlists in the United States Army, and the structure of military life seems to suit him in a way ordinary life never quite had, methodical, disciplined, good at following someone else's procedure and, it will turn out, even better at building his own. Investigators who later reconstructed his service record found a young man who excelled at exactly the skills that would matter later: land navigation, self-sufficiency in the field, an ability to plan for contingencies most people never think to plan for. He leaves the Army in the early 2000s and drifts, spending time in the small fishing community of Knee Bay at the very tip of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, working construction jobs and, according to people who knew him there, coming across as reliable, hard-working, and almost aggressively unremarkable. It's in this period, by his own later account, that he commits what he describes as his first killing, a couple in rural Washington state, a case never fully corroborated with confirmed identified victims before his death, and one of the loose threads investigators are left holding when the file finally closes. He eventually settles in Anchorage, Alaska, around 2007. By then, he's assembled a modest, self-employed life that looks, from the outside, like a success story in miniature. He runs his own construction and remodeling business, taking small residential jobs across Anchorage, kitchen updates, deck repairs, the kind of steady, word-of-mouth work that keeps a small operation afloat without ever drawing attention. He has a long-time girlfriend and a young daughter. Neighbors describe a helpful, low-key guy who plows their driveways in winter without being asked twice, the kind of neighbor people describe, almost reflexively, as the last person they'd ever suspect of anything. What none of them know is that by the time Israel Keyes arrives in Alaska, he's already been killing people for years, and that almost every piece of his adult life, right down to the construction business that gives him a plausible reason to travel for supplies and work, has been quietly built around making that possible. Here's the part investigators will spend months trying to fully map out. Keyes doesn't kill the way most violent offenders do, close to home, returning again and again to a familiar hunting ground. He does something almost nobody in the documented history of American serial crime has been caught doing at this scale. He travels, sometimes thousands of miles, specifically to kill strangers he has zero connection to, in places nobody would ever think to look for a link back to him. And to make that logistics problem work, he needs supplies waiting for him whenever he lands, without ever once leaving a paper trail buying them. So, years in advance, sometimes on trips explicitly built around exactly this purpose, Keyes drives out to remote, forgettable stretches of land across multiple states and buries containers. Cash. Rope. Sometimes a firearm. Sometimes tools meant for one purpose only. He chooses spots he can find again using nothing but memory and rough distance from some fixed landmark, a specific mile marker, a bend in a creek, a stand of trees off an unmarked forest road. Then he leaves, sometimes for years, until a future version of himself needs exactly what's sitting in the ground at that exact coordinate. He told investigators later that he thought of it almost like insurance. What he didn't tell them, not for a long time, and maybe not completely, ever, was how many of those policies he'd actually taken out, or in how many different states they were sitting, waiting. The method takes shape over roughly a decade of trial and adjustment, and it's built on one idea above everything else: put as much distance and as much time as possible between the crime and the man who committed it. Keyes picks a city, often one he already has a legitimate reason to visit, a supply run for a job, a family trip, on at least one occasion a vacation booked well in advance and paid for with his own name on the reservation. He flies in under his own identity, because flying under his own identity is completely unremarkable, which is precisely the point. Once he lands, he rents a car and drives, sometimes for hours, occasionally crossing one or two state lines, until he's far enough from the airport that nothing on paper connects the eventual crime scene to his arrival. He avoids anyone with a real link to him, no acquaintances, no co-workers, no exes, nobody who could ever put his name and theirs in the same sentence. He looks instead for pure opportunity, an isolated house, an empty stretch of parking lot near closing time, a person alone with no witnesses in view. Investigators who study offenders like this sometimes use a phrase for exactly this pattern: a crime with no logical entry point, no relationship to trace, nothing linking killer to victim, because there genuinely isn't anything to find. What is corroborated later, cross-checked against travel records, rental agreements, and Keyes' own eventual admissions, is a pattern stretching across roughly a decade and multiple states, sometimes with years of quiet gap between one trip and the next. Victims chosen essentially at random. Evidence destroyed or buried within hours of the crime. Almost nothing connecting any two cases to each other, let alone to a quiet Anchorage contractor with a daughter and a driveway full of snowplow contracts. It's a pattern so deliberately fragmented that, for years, no two investigating agencies in two different states have any reason to believe they're looking at the same man. By 2011, Keyes has been running this system for nearly 10 years without so much as a parking ticket tying him to a single one of his crimes. He has a business, a family, a modest, well-liked reputation around Anchorage. And in June of that year, more than 3,000 miles from home, he's about to prove exactly how far a system like that can stretch when nobody is looking for it. Essex, Vermont, a quiet town northeast of Burlington, on the night of June 8, 2011. Bill and Lorraine Currier are a married couple in their 50s, both steadily employed at local businesses, both well-liked in a town small enough that most people know most people, and both about to disappear from their own bedroom without a single sign of struggle anyone in the neighborhood will notice for days. Keyes has flown into New York under his own name on a trip that, on paper, looks entirely unremarkable. From there he drives across the state line into Vermont, a place he has never lived, has no family in, and has no documented connection to whatsoever. According to what he later tells investigators, he'd specifically looked for a state with a reputation for being safe, reasoning that lower crime meant fewer suspects police would already be watching, and fewer neighbors conditioned to notice anything unusual. He settles on the Keyes modest house essentially because it fits criteria he's refined for a decade: a detached home, minimal exterior lighting, no dog, nothing suggesting a security system. He gets inside sometime after midnight, subdues both of them at gunpoint, and forces them out to a vehicle. By morning, Bill and Lorraine Currier are simply gone. The local investigation that follows is thorough, and it goes nowhere, for reasons that have nothing to do with the work being sloppy. Vermont, per capita, is one of the safest states in the country for something like this to happen in, which turns out to be exactly the problem for the detectives assigned to the case. Investigators pull financial records for both Keyes, looking for debt, gambling, anything that might explain a targeted disappearance. They come up empty. They canvass every neighbor on the street, twice, looking for anyone who noticed an unfamiliar car. Nothing. They look into both Keyes' workplaces, their extended families, any history of conflict either might have had with anyone, co-workers, in-laws, old acquaintances. None of it points anywhere. Local police work it for weeks, then months, and none of it leads anywhere, because the actual explanation, a total stranger flew in from 3,000 miles away, killed them, and flew home before anyone even realized they were missing, isn't a theory a small-town investigation is built to consider on its own. There is, in the truest sense, no lead to run down, because the man responsible left behind nothing that connects to anything in either victim's life. The Currier case goes cold. Not the kind of cold where leads slowly dry up over time. The kind of cold where there was never really a lead to follow in the first place. 2 states, 2 disappearances, and as far as anyone actually investigating either one can tell in the moment, absolutely nothing connecting them. But this isn't an isolated crime by a man passing through once. It's one data point in a pattern that's about to bring a federal task force from 3,000 miles away, in a case that starts, of all places, at a coffee stand. Anchorage, Alaska, the evening of February 1, 2012. It's a Wednesday, already fully dark by mid-afternoon the way it always is at that latitude in winter, and 18-year-old Samantha Koenig is working a closing shift at Common Grounds, a small drive-up espresso stand not far from downtown. She's a barista and a musician, well-liked by regulars who stop by on their way home from work, the kind of employee a small business owner counts on to lock up properly every night without being reminded. Sometime after she closes the stand for the night, she vanishes. Her boyfriend reports her missing the next day. At first, Anchorage police treat it roughly the way most 18-year-old disappearances get treated in the earliest hours: a possible runaway, a fight with a partner, a kid who needed some space and forgot to say so. That theory doesn't survive very long. Surveillance video from a nearby business recovers grainy nighttime footage of a masked figure approaching the coffee stand right around closing time, and within it, brief and badly lit, what looks like Koenig being forced away from the counter. Within days, the case has escalated from a routine missing persons report to a full abduction investigation, with Anchorage police and, soon after, the FBI both actively involved. Then, days later, something reshapes the entire case. A ransom note surfaces, not delivered in person, but left somewhere it's guaranteed to be found, along with a photograph of Koenig, apparently alive, holding a recent newspaper as proof of the date. It reads like something out of an old kidnapping film, demanding payment for her safe return, and for a moment, investigators allow themselves to believe exactly what it's designed to make them believe, that this is a live hostage situation, with a victim still breathing somewhere, waiting to be found in time. She isn't. What none of them know yet is that the ransom scheme unfolding in front of them was never built to bring Samantha Koenig home. It was built to buy her killer enough time to leave the state entirely. Here's what investigators eventually pieced together, over weeks and then months, through digital forensics, financial records, and Keyes' own later admissions. Samantha Koenig was killed the same night she was taken, at Keyes' own home in Anchorage, only hours after the abduction. But Keyes doesn't leave the state right away. Instead, he spends the following days staging the appearance that she's still alive, the newspaper photo, a sequence of text messages sent from her phone designed to read as though she's the one typing them, building, piece by piece, the illusion of an active hostage situation that he then quietly walks away from. He drafts the ransom demand with the same deliberate patience he brought to burying Kit's years in advance, choosing wording generic enough to sound like any anonymous kidnapper, specific enough to keep investigators believing there's still someone alive to negotiate for. Because within roughly 2 weeks of the abduction, Keyes leaves Alaska entirely, on a trip that, again, looks completely unremarkable on paper, eventually making his way south and east through the lower 48 while a ransom scheme he engineered to look ongoing keeps playing out behind him, texts arriving on a schedule, demands escalating, an entire fabricated timeline built around a hostage who has already been dead for weeks. The unraveling starts with money. The ransom instructions call for payment to be loaded directly onto Koenig's own debit card, and once that happens, whoever's controlling the card starts making withdrawals, not in Alaska, but steadily south, cropping up on ATM surveillance in city after city as federal investigators race to build a trail out of nothing but timestamps and grainy photographs. Each withdrawal narrows the map a little further. Investigators cross-reference bank records against flight manifests, rental car agreements, hotel check-ins, anything that might put a single name in the same city as a single withdrawal on a single date. Each one puts investigators a little closer to a specific stretch of road in a specific state, closing in on a man who has spent a decade making absolutely sure a trail like this could never be built. By mid-March, that trail leads investigators to Texas. In recorded interviews conducted after his arrest, Keyes reportedly describes the ransom scheme almost the way a contractor walks a client through a project timeline, sequenced steps, deliberate delays, a plan built to manufacture distance while looking, to anyone watching from the outside, exactly like a live negotiation. Agents who reviewed those tapes would later describe his tone during these sections as almost clinically flat, the same register he might use explaining a kitchen remodel. It's one of the details that stays with the agents in that Anchorage interview room months later, the same room where he'll eventually sketch that rough map of the country and tell them about the kit they'll never find. March 13, 2012. Texas law enforcement, working off the ATM trail the FBI has helped construct, locates and arrests Israel Keyes in Lufkin, in the eastern part of the state. He's carrying a substantial amount of cash, and investigators recover items in his vehicle connecting him directly to Samantha Koenig. Within days, he's extradited back to Alaska to face charges in her death. What follows over the next several months is less a standard interrogation than a long, strange negotiation stretched across dozens of separate sessions. Interview 1 produces almost nothing usable. Keyes testing exactly how much leverage he has before he commits to anything. By interview 4, he's confirmed his identity in the surveillance footage and acknowledged killing Koenig, though only in the barest outline. Session by session, the fragments accumulate. A state named here. A season named there. A confession, eventually and specifically, to killing Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont the summer before, closing at last a case that had sat entirely cold for nearly a year on the far side of the country. Word of what Keyes represents spreads through law enforcement circles fast. Within weeks, detectives from other states, some with unsolved disappearances stretching back years, start requesting time with him, hoping the pattern he's describing might finally explain a case that's been sitting untouched in their own files. Some sessions produce nothing. A few produce enough detail, a highway, a season, a rough description of terrain, to reopen cases that had been closed for good, or to finally give a name to a case that had only ever existed as an unidentified victim in a file drawer. He never gives them everything. Whether that's a calculated strategy to delay a death penalty case, or something closer to a man rationing out the last form of control he has left, is something investigators would debate for years afterward without ever landing on an answer that fully satisfies anyone. There was just one problem investigators never solved in time. Every session brought them closer to understanding how Israel Keyes operated. None of them brought them any closer to a full list of who he'd actually killed. On December 2, 2012, before his case ever reaches trial, Israel Keyes is found dead in his cell at the Anchorage jail. He has taken his own life, cutting his wrist and using a bedsheet to finish what the cut alone hadn't, leaving behind a note investigators would later describe as characteristically controlled, final, on his own terms, handled the same deliberate way he'd handled every other part of this. There is no trial. There is no full accounting. There is only whatever he'd chosen to say across those interview sessions, and whatever he'd chosen, just as deliberately, to keep for himself. In the years since, investigators have never been able to close the book on Israel Keyes the way they typically close a case this size. Some estimates put his total number of victims as low as 8, based only on what was ever confirmed. Others, based on the fragments he gave up before his death, suggest the real number could be considerably higher, cases in multiple states that were never fully confirmed, never fully connected, because the entire method he spent a decade refining was designed specifically to make that kind of connection impossible to draw. Somewhere out there, by his own account, there are still kits sitting in the ground. Cash. Tools. Whatever else he buried. Sitting untouched at coordinates that exist nowhere now but in a dead man's memory. His case has since become something profilers and federal investigators point to when they talk about a particular kind of offender, one with no relationship to any victim, no local pattern to trace, no obvious motive linking killer to crime scene, because there was never anything there to find in the first place. Law enforcement training on stranger abduction cases has referenced his methodology since, precisely because it broke so many of the assumptions those investigations are normally built on. It's changed, in a small but lasting way, how some of these cases get worked from the very first hour. Picture that interview room one more time. Keyes, hunched slightly over a legal pad, sketching the rough outline of a country he'd spent a decade treating like a hunting ground, tapping a spot somewhere in the Midwest with the end of his pen. One he says you'll never find. Whether that was true, whether it was theater, or whether it was simply the last piece of leverage a man facing the rest of his life in prison had left to hold on to, nobody left alive can say for certain. The map still exists somewhere in a case file in Alaska. The ground it points to has never been dug up.